humorous and interesting talk, especially on the two very important years, 1819 and 1965. So tomorrow is the weekend, you can buy 1819 and 1965, $2 big, $2 small, to be described. Okay, so our third and final speaker this evening is Philip Holden. Philip is professor in the Department of English Language and Literature at the National University of Singapore. He researches Singapore literature and Southeast Asian literature within a wider context of post-colonial literatures, and is interested in the way that concepts drawn from the study of narrative fiction can be used to look at the wider social narratives that we share. Philip also worked outside the university as an editor, writer, heritage activist, and social commentator. So Philip's talk this evening is titled Questioning from Third World to First.
Thanks, Dan. I think we're all in a bit kind of lecture mode at the moment, unfortunately. You have to forgive us. It's the end of the semester. And so what I will do is I'll try and get things moving quite quickly and go through quite quickly so that we get some time for discussion. I just wanted to say that, I am somebody who works in literary studies. I'm not a historian. And so what I'll probably emphasize tonight is thinking about the notion of what a myth actually is. And I think we actually put it very, very well at the beginning. It's something which is, we're not saying it's not true, right? But it's a way of organizing our thoughts, of making sense of the world. We all tell ourselves stories about the world. We make it up from everything we see in the world, everything we confront. We can't make up something that has no correspondence with the facts. And yet, I think what often happens is we select, and selecting also means forgetting. And there's certain stories which are useful at some times, and they may not be useful later on. So what I'm going to talk about today is actually a myth which has actually surprisingly recent. It's this phrase from third world to first, and it really only comes into common usage in Singapore in the year 2000 after the second volume of the memoirs, right? So as you may guess, but it draws upon older things that were there before. And my contention is that it may be useful in some ways, but maybe as Singapore, we're going through certain kinds of changes, it may actually be worth thinking about other kinds of myths that we could have. Right? So let me just move on, and let me show you the myth in the raw, if you like, if this works, right? I don't think we can get it up, but you can probably see it anyway, right? On the, on the screen, right? Yeah. Okay, we can start. I think we just, it's got subtitles anyway. Yeah, so, yeah. It's got subtitles anyway, so it doesn't matter, I think. Yeah. So this is National Day Message 2014. And this is the first thing I saw when I came back to Singapore, actually, from being away in July, so it struck me, right? Yeah. And then we start with the pioneers. The spirit of our pioneers, they had worked hard to take Singapore from third world to first. They work together. Thanks to them, we have Singapore. And then the pioneer generation package comes along too, as you know. And all the rest is history, right? So I'm kind of curious myself, what I guess I'm curious about it is what are the kind of contours of this myth? What really is going on in this myth? And I put it this way. I think the myth would go something like this, right? In the period then, 1965 to the middle of the 1990s, Singapore moved from being a third world country, to being a first world country. And I think part of the myth also, and I think this is something that Kai-Kun also touched on in a different kind of way, is that this was achieved through hard work of all Singaporeans, a trust in government institutions, and a lack of divisive politics, right? And I think there's certain things that underlie that myth as well. The first one, I think, is that maximizing economic growth is still seen as being central to Singapore's survival as a nation, right? The second is, and I think there's a sneaking thing there, that Singaporeans are told, and I think sometimes we also tell each other, that we're not quite mature enough, not quite ready to be a first world society. So that is undercurrent too as well. And I think the curious thing is that third world and first world in this story tend to oscillate or move around between being economic categories and being moral categories. And interestingly, this is a very common myth throughout society. Remember, we got 2011 mentioned. Remember, Workers' Party, very successful. What was the slogan towards a first world parliament, right? So it's not simply used by one political party, it's actually a generalized myth, right? So let's go back and think a bit about this. The first thing I'd like to do is rather briefly just talk about the economics and why the economics are problematic. I don't want to spend too much time on this, and it's actually something that could be talked about much more extensively. But basically, we could do something like this. If we have some retrospective categories here, in admittedly retrospective terms, in 1965, Singapore was not a third world country, it was a middle income country in anything we say, right? So if you get a comparison there of per capita GDP in 1965, right? You've got Rwanda and South Korea. South Korea has just survived, remember, it's just come through an incredible civil war. You've got Mexico, Portugal, Singapore and Jordan together, you're about $500 per capita GDP. Japan is rising already, UK is much farther off, right? So it's a middle-income country in those terms, right? The second thing is if you have, just go on any kind of academic discussion that's going on in Singapore in 1965, you get things like this. This is Lucian Pai, a famous sinologist, right? And Pai saying, Singapore is the richest city in the richest country in Southeast Asia. This is 1965, just before separation, right? He's still thinking Malaysia. It's like early 1965, right? Singapore is distinctive in the Afro-Asian world because it is moving beyond the state of being industrial entrepot and is rapidly becoming an industrial society, right? 1965, right? Not saying anything about income distribution and social inequality, which is another issue, right? And I think it's a more interesting issue. But we're talking about, on purely per capita income terms, 1965 to 2000 would be from middle income to very affluent, not from third world to first. Right? That's the first thing. The second thing I want to talk about a bit more is the actual issue of the moral category, because I think that's much more important and that conditions us in ways that we don't think about maybe very much. So I've taken a long quote again from Lee Kuan Yew's first set of memoirs about the third world, right? And this is actually to the third world, it's looking back, and it's looking back from a perspective now. He's writing it in 1996, 1997, he's looking back at those moments, that time of his encounter with the third world. Won't read it out, but his idea that when he went, when Northern Rhodesia was a British colony, everything worked. He goes back when it becomes independent, 5 years later, things don't work so well. He goes back 20 years later, it's even worse, right? What's the problem? Okay, I'd received an unforgettable lesson in decolonization when misguided policies based on half-digested theories of socialism and redistribution of the wealth were compounded by less than competent government. Societies formerly held together by colonial power splintered with appalling consequences. That's the story from third world to first, told from the perspective of the present. It's told from 1996 onwards, right? But if we go back in history, I think we'll see that Singapore had a very, very different attitude towards socialism and towards the third world. And indeed, the PAP leadership had a very different attitude. So let's go back and let's do this history, right? Let's think a bit about what was happening in the world as Singapore moved towards independence, as Malaya moved towards independence, right? Singapore's independence, as we know, comes at the end of a much larger wave of decolonization. I guess you could say it starts in 1946 in the Philippines, It ends substantially, apart from a few holdouts, in 1975 when Portugal's African colonies get independence, right? In that, you've got a movement in Singapore, if you go today, you go on Shenton Way, and you see all those magnificent, huge buildings. And you find this grubby little building, it's called the Afro-Asia building, it's still there, right? And that's a memory of something that was there in the past, and that was the idea of Afro-Asia. What was the idea of Afro-Asia? What was the idea of the Third World? It was a desire both for change from a colonial society, but also a desire for a more equal society at the same time. The colonial elites were not simply going to persist, things were going to change. How is that going to be done? It was practically all through socialism, right? Most of these countries were explicitly socialist. The PAP in 1959, the 59 Manifesto, which is a wonderful document, is called, is in pursuit of socialism. Actually, interestingly enough, Battle for Merger has been reissued. The recent cover is very bland. The original was part of a series called Paths to Socialism, but strangely enough, that hasn't made it into the reprint. So PAP Manifesto, 1959, 1964, Lee Kuan Yew goes on this mission, remember, around all the 90 countries in Africa, in the Third World, to attempt to explain what Malaysia is. The Third World is very important. 1966, actually, when Kwame Nkrumah is overthrown, I was doing some research in the archives in Accra, which are great because the wonderful thing about the archives in Accra was that Nkrumah was overthrown, so everything was preserved. And everything is open. His bar bills, his cigarette bills, everything like that, his champagne bills, and all his other stuff, which is really nice. And a contrast, I think, with some of us working in Singapore history, where access to archives is very, very difficult, right? What do I find in there? A letter from Lee Kuan Yew to Nkrumah, 1966, expressing admiration for Nkrumah and Nkrumah's commitment to socialism. Nkrumah has actually, now how that got there I don't know, because it must have been brought back later, because it was written to Nkrumah when he was in Conakry. Actually, he was in exile. Lee Kuan Yew had no motivation to do this in a Machiavellian sense, but was expressing admiration for him as a fellow socialist. 66. Fast forward a bit more, let's look at what's going on. Move to the 1970s. In the 1970s, the PAP leaves Socialist International because the Dutch Labour Party moves a motion criticising it, and they leave precipitately. There's a wonderful book edited by Devon Iyer called Socialism That Works, The Singapore Way. There's a great essay in it by S. Rajaratnam in which he castigates the European socialists for not understanding that what true Third World socialism is and being patronizing towards the Third World. Quote here, you European socialist parties have to sit in the International with lesser breeds who in their own way have made a reasonable success of democratic socialism and who steadfastly refuse to acknowledge either their dependence on or inferiority before your eminences. 1976, arguing as a representative of the Third World. Doesn't end yet. 85, right? 1985, Lee Kuan Yew, privileged to speak to a joint meeting of Congress, both Senate and the House of Representatives. What does he say? I'm greatly honored by your invitation to address this joint meeting of the United States Congress. It cannot be often that someone representing 2.5 million people from this is a bit smaller, yeah, 2.5 million, okay, population different, right? From a small country in the Third World is offers the opportunity to address representatives of 240 million people, right? Why is he so anxious to address them? What does he find inspiring? Well, it's this idealism that inspired the Founding Fathers. The Founding Fathers, again, were people who went through a process of decolonization, right, of fighting against the mother country, right, and yeah. So 1965, 1985, and I think by that time, actually, what starts to happen is socialism, I mean, sort of the Third World starts dropping out. So if you look at parliamentary debates around about that time, you'll find that there's not much mention of the Third World in positive terms after the mid-1980s. But socialism actually continues. It continues in 1990s when George Yeo, who's one of the more interesting of that generation of leadership, to talk about supply-side socialism. It persists even until, I think that 2007, Lee Kuan Yew actually talks to a group of young PAP members at St. Beijing's power station. And he quotes approvingly a study by a Swedish academic who says that Singapore's system is basically still socialist, right? And even if you go into things like WikiLeaks, you know, the WikiLeaks stuff that came out 2 or 3 years ago, and the American ambassador, I think it's Cho Sola who's talking to the American ambassador, right? And he's saying, you know, you may be surprised when the young PAP get together, we still call each other comrade, but don't be alarmed. It doesn't mean anything anymore. Right? So just to say, this notion of the third world and socialism, I think, has a much more complicated history, right, than we actually now take it credit for. And I think in some ways, if we can revive or rethink how in Singapore we were connected to socialism and to the third world, it actually makes a much more interesting narrative and a much more, I think, useful narrative to today when we're dealing with issues of relationships to the globe and relationships in terms of social inequality. It's much more useful than maybe the previous narrative. So one thing I also wanted to do is, I sort of vaguely promised, and probably wrongly in my talk, that I would think of an alternative narrative, right? So I wouldn't just problematize narratives, which is what literally people do, right? All the time they complain about narratives and stories, but I'd invent a new one. So I'm going to have a try, right? And it's more of a thought experiment. It's about 5 minutes. This is another way of doing it, right? Another way of trying to do third world to first in a different kind of way. And I guess to do this, I think of it in this way, right? Most narratives and stories of nationhood, the way you tell stories, are what we call, in literary studies, a romance. Now, by a romance, we don't mean, oh, I fall in love with you, right? A romance is actually a kind of quest narrative, right? In which somebody, you know, goes upon this wonderful journey in pursuit of a goal, right? They go out into the world. Raffles is another example of this, right? Raffles' quest for free trade, for modernity, everything like that, never quite achieved, never quite made. A lot of national stories are like that, right? Go Chok Dong, right? Singapore is not yet a nation, it's not a state, it's a sovereign entity, and that was in 1999. We must make the Singapore tribe, he said, right? So there's a certain sense in which we must arrive at nationhood. It's that goal somewhere in the future we never get to, right? And that's a very common way of talking about nations. It's not just Singapore. But there's also another way of talking about nations, and this is actually a more difficult one, but it happens sometimes when a nation goes through a period of introspection, right? And that's in the mode of tragedy. And tragedy is when you have something that seems to be going really well, you have a rise of something, and then it starts falling apart because of hubris, because of pride, and also because of internal flaws. Now, the classic example of this, of course, is Nazi Germany, or Germany after the war, how it thought about its past. I'm not saying Singapore is like Nazi Germany going Singapore, but it's more an illustration to say, well, we could think about it in a different way. If we could start thinking about it in this way, what would we do? Well, I think what we could think about is something like this. If we go back to that first PAP cabinet, and I think I always think, go to 1959, don't go to 1965. 59 is a much better story than 65, right? 59, that government that's elected by massive popular acclaim with a very radical program, unites the left and the right of the PAP as they will be. But one of the things actually to think about rather surprisingly is if you look at the cabinet, it's actually predominantly English educated, and apart from Ahmed Ibrahim, everybody there actually has an Anglophone university education, which is quite amazing at the time, right? So what made these people interesting? What made these founding fathers, another set of founding fathers, what made them kind of unique or interesting? I would say one thing. All of these people had privileged backgrounds, but all of them were suddenly jolted out of that privilege in the early 1940s during the Japanese occupation. They had to suddenly confront being powerless. Even someone like Roger Altman, who escapes to London, had to kind of drift around in London and not get his law degree and fail to do all those things he's meant to do and have a generally rather strange kind of time, I think, right? So they were in a way knocked out of that kind of maybe sense of complacency, right? Or that sense of privilege. Happened to all of them. And then I think it's, if you think about it, this starts, you look at what their concerns in the 1950s, think of Dr. Goh before he comes into government, all that work he does on social inequality in Singapore, all those reports he writes as part of the Social Welfare Department, how important that was. That kind of change happened, right? Example, just a quote from Goh Keng Swee, in 1957. Yeah, okay, no comment on that, but I think Dr. Goh has a very different attitude maybe than you might find today in governance towards the attitude of wages, right? So what happens after 65 in this story, right? Well, I'd say something like this, right? 59 to 60, let's say 1959 to 1989, let's take it that way, right? In 1959, walls start coming up in Singapore, you get Queenstown being developed. You get that incredible takeoff for 30 years. Singapore really is an incredible example in that way in terms of social development. In 1989, another wall comes down, half a world away in Berlin. It's the end of the Cold War. But the end of the Cold War is rather strange. It's the end of history, right? So people say, supposedly, right? The communism has failed, socialism at the bloc has failed. But what seems to happen in Europe and throughout the world is that people are also tired of Reagan, they're tired of Thatcher, they're tired of that free market economics. They're looking for what is vaguely called the third way, right? So in Britain you have Tony Blair, in America you have Bill Clinton, even somewhere like Taiwan, the DPP are not just about, I think DPP are not just about nationalism, they're also about social equality as well. How can you in some ways infuse commitments to social equality into a capitalist system, and everybody starts beating a path to Singapore's door, right? So actually Tony Blair comes to Singapore before he becomes Prime Minister in England. And when he comes to Singapore, he starts talking about the stakeholder society based upon what he sees in Singapore, right? But just at that time, unfortunately in Singapore, a second generation of leaders is taking over in the early 1990s, right? And this group of leaders hasn't had that humbling experience of the Second World War. They haven't had that experience of being dislodged from privilege. And so what seems to happen is, it looks like everything's working, you get hubris, you get continued economic takeoff, and maybe you get a sense in which economic growth becomes paramount, right? And that legacy of the Third World, that legacy of socialism is forgotten. And who to turn to, in conclusion, who to turn to think about this? Who would give the best quote possible? And I thought, we're all teachers here, and it's always good to go back to people's teachers. And so I thought I'd go back to someone who was Goh Keng Swee's teacher, who was Lee Kuan Yew's teacher, who was Miss Kwa's teacher, who was Yu Chu Yip's teacher, Yu Chu Yip, who was the MCP the General Secretary as well, who was Lim Kim San's teacher as well, who was an economics teacher at Raffles College and the University of Malaya. It was a man called Thomas Silcock, right? He was quite an interesting figure, sort of a wrinkle in history, if you like. Was actually professor of economics at Raffles College, University of Malaya, right the way through to 1960, right? And Silcock actually then taught all these figures, right, as economics students. Lee Kuan Yew probably for 1 year, he doesn't quite remember if he taught him or not, but probably did. That 1 year before Japanese occupation, Miss Kwa probably definitely yes, right? And in 1982, Silcock came back, right, to Singapore, and they caught him and they did an oral history interview. And it's a very interesting oral history interview, it's a very, very long one. But I thought the conclusion of the interview was very interesting. And what Silcock said was, I'm very proud of my former students, and they've exceeded me in many kind of ways. I would never claim credit for what happened in Singapore. And yet, I start looking around and I think, well, it's wonderful. The social engineering in terms of housing has shown a great deal of imagination, but I worry about the extent to which the tourist trade and the making of Singapore a great financial centre have contributed to the idea that adding to the wealth of Singapore is of great importance. Originally, it was adding primarily to the wealth of people who were desperately poor and giving them a decent life. And that is the main aim, and that has been achieved in 1982. And in order to go on achieving, they feel they must go on advancing because otherwise they can't remain a nation. And then I really like this last sort of sentence or two, because economists don't generally talk about this kind of thing, and yet it's a very nice thing for an economist to say. And he says this: that's not what it's for. I feel very strongly about this. Economics is about getting rid of poverty. It's not about making people richer. Right? And for me, that's maybe a suggestion of what a different kind of narrative, a different way of telling the past in Singapore might be, and might be possible. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.